Hey everybody, welcome again to Bear Outfitters. Today we're going to be talking about the buff versus the bandana. Which of these two pieces of backcountry gear reigns supreme? I know this is a semi-controversial subject, so if you're a huge fan of the buff or a huge fan of carrying a bandana, please don't unlike or unsubscribe from my channel just because I diss on your favorite piece of gear. So if you like anything that we talk about here today, please be sure to like and subscribe. So for those that don't know, a buff is essentially a long tube of fabric that is sewn together on one side that you can use for a multitude of different purposes. Huge fans of the buff say that it is the best piece of gear and it's the most diverse piece of gear that you can use in the backcountry. I posit that that's not necessarily true and that there's not a whole lot that you can do with a buff that you can't do with a bandana. So the buff costs around $20 retail and a bandana costs about $2 retail. So I'm going to go through some of the uses that people talk about for the buff, and I'm going to talk about how you can use a bandana to cover most of them. And if you're not going out in very cold conditions, a bandana will probably conquer all the same things that a buff will do for you, and maybe even some more. The first thing that a lot of people use a buff for is for a neck gaiter, and then they do this. They bring it up into a face mask, and then they'll do this. They'll bring it up into a balaclava, and then they'll take it up and they'll use it at night as a hoodie. And these are all fantastic things that you can do with a buff. I mean, these are all great things, and I think that the buff has its place, and I use mine to sleep with, so I don't have to bring a beanie because it weighs a little bit less than my beanie. But I'm going to point out in just a second that all of these are things that a bandana can do. The other thing that a lot of buff aficionados say is that they'll use their buff to grab their hot pot, and that's great, but I'm going to point again, that's something that a bandana can do. Now, I will say that one thing that the buff does really well is it does work really well as a beanie. If you don't want to bring two pieces of gear, you don't want to bring a bandana and a beanie, the buff does do a really good job of acting as both. But I will say that the bandana does do a couple of things that a buff doesn't do, and we're going to talk about those next. Now, if you were to go into the backcountry anywhere between 10 and 15 years ago, and you go back and you look at all the cool folks that are out in the backcountry, one of the things that they all have is they've got their bandana and they wrap it up just like this and they soak it in water and they put it around their neck, and the really cool girls would have like a little knot that would like do their little thing over here, and that's great and that's wonderful. Scouts have been using neckerchiefs, which is essentially a bandana, for decades and decades and decades, and if you go back to any old scout book, it'll show you different ways that you can use it in first aid, as a sling, as a bandage, as all these cool things. And I posit that with the exception of being a beanie, I don't think there's really anything that a buff can do that a bandana can't do. So I'm going to go through a couple of the things that we talked about buffs doing, and I'm going to show you how you can do it with a bandana. Neck gaiter. You're going to tie this just like this. You've got neck protection. Do you need to rob a train? Well, it's going to do all the same things that your buff did. Want to keep your head warm or put a little bit of water up there to help keep your head cool? This thing's going to work too. Now that said, I do feel a little bit like Prison Mike. The worst thing about jail was the Dementors. Now the one thing that I will say that a handkerchief or a neckerchief does do better than a buff is acting as a bandage in a first aid scenario. Now this is just a regular old cotton handkerchief, and you can find it at any clothing stores, even some hardware stores will carry them for $1 or $2 tops. And I will tell you, I was once shot in the arm with a nail gun, and the only thing that I had on me was part of my everyday carry, which is a handkerchief. And now, before you get on me for this was a dumb moment. I was in shock. They shot me with a 3-inch nail gun into my arm, and they said, well, do you want to pull it out? And I said, yes, pull it out. And so they pulled it out, and I started bleeding. Now, in hindsight, they should not have pulled the nail out. That's what you go to the hospital for. But what I did is I grabbed my clean handkerchief out of my pocket and I applied direct pressure. And so I think that you could do that with a buff, but basically what I ended up doing is tying it off and then taking myself to the hospital. So I would say that a handkerchief is much better for that kind of scenario where you're going to be rendering first aid with it. It's not a clean bandage, but it's oftentimes better than no bandage. With the buff, I mentioned picking up hot pots. You can pick it up with a cotton handkerchief too. So, are you team buff or team bandana? Please leave me a comment, drop me a comment below on which one you are. Like and subscribe for more content, and I hope to be bringing you guys some more stuff soon.